I recently saw a video titled Morality is for Friends Only. And the video basically argues that all morality and all ethics is based solely on the desire of a group or a tribe to preserve itself, preserve its survival, and also to maintain cohesion and agreement amongst people within the tribe. And that those who are not your friend, those who are outside of your tribe, do not deserve moral courtesy. And among the many errors and the many, I think, confusions of this video and the speaker who makes all of these different arguments, I noticed that this kind of thinking is actually a theme in the current political discourse throughout America and throughout the West. And this particular line of reasoning is a form of what is called the friend enemy distinction. And so, since I have seen this kind of rise in various different parts of the discourse, I think it is very important for all of us as thinking people, all of us who love civilization and who love the idea of society as it's properly understood, bound by moral order, to understand what this friend-enemy distinction is saying, to articulate a response to it, and then to propose a better roadmap for seeing conflict within the context of civil society. So in this video, my friends, we're going to actually address this friend-enemy distinction. We're going to address this sort of error and about moral thinking that can be reduced to friend and enemy and utility. And we're also going to pose a roadmap going forward. So before we get in that mindset, how are you doing? Well, I am Christian Watson. Thank you so much for being here. If you enjoy political and social commentary from a philosophical bent, then I must implore you, please like, share, comment, subscribe, do whatever you can, my friends, to ensure that our message and this channel is successful. My friends, this is a civic conservative project. If you believe the fundamental philosophical character of the American experiment is fundamentally good and is worth pushing forth into the current political discourse with moral clarity and philosophical rigor, this is the channel for you. If you believe America deserves better defenders who are not sensationalists, but they work in the ways of edification and not simply excitement, this is the channel for you. Thank you guys so much for being here. And now please enjoy the video. So, before I proceed, and before I get into the meat of this video, I want to say this video is actually dedicated to a friend of mine named Michael Marino, who himself was actually a moral thinker in his own right. Michael, a few years ago, many of you may remember, he actually exposed a scandal in a collegiate debate where he was basically docked points and punished for articulating arguments that were conservative and against the left-wing orthodoxy within the debate space, which kind of goes against the entire principle of debate. Well, Michael disappeared a few years ago in 2023, and I want his legacy to still stand strong, and I want his thinking to be remembered as well as the beacon of light that it certainly was. And so, in the spirit of true friendship, not friend-enemy distinction friendship, but in the spirit of true friendship, this is a video dedicated to Michael. So thank you all for acknowledging that. Now, to proceed. So, as I mentioned, this video I saw was actually quite interesting. I ran across it in my recommended feed, and the video basically said that the reason that morality and moral behavior is for friends only is because morality and moral behavior are geared towards the evolutionary survival of a group, and that since man is a tribal creature, this thinking goes, he is therefore oriented towards the preservation of his tribe. And since he also wants to ensure that his tribe doesn't hate him, he's measured towards the cohesion of his tribe, which means those in his tribe have to like him. And therefore, that's why at a very basic level, we engage in moral behavior. Now, and by the way, you all can go and watch this video for yourself. For sake of copyright and also sake of the time of this video, I will not be putting clips of this video in my video. But there are several problems with this line of thinking. Number one, this line of thinking actually reduces all moral behavior to the level of self-preservation. But it does so in a way that detaches self-preservation from the concrete and measurable person, the individual, and puts it on the level of the tribe. So not only does it artificially limit all moral thinking in a way that makes it very difficult to actually see the whole of moral thinking and understand the nature of moral behavior, but it also removes the moral agent that is particularly involved in creating an action that can be considered moral or immoral. The moment you ignore the person that is actually involved in creating moral or immoral acts is the moment you have no sound basis by which to talk about morality in the first place. Also, self-preservation, my friends, even though, yes, it is an evolutionarily developed trait, it is the foundation of society It is the foundation of moral thinking, but it is not the end-all, be-all. In fact, self-preservation is simply what allows all of us to have the ability to talk about further moral thinking and moral behavior in the first place, because if we didn't have self-preservation, we wouldn't be living in order to do so. But the moment you say self-preservation exists, and therefore it ought to constitute the whole of our thinking, is to reduce a complex topic to a very simplified understanding, and therefore to remove all of the different levels and complexities that topic represents. Self-preservation does not simply imply survival. Man is not simply made to survive. He's made to create. He's not only made to create, he's made to thrive in a social context. And the social context goes beyond his in-group. In fact, oftentimes in big civilizations, even those based in the old world, like ancient Rome, survival includes people who are outside of his in-group. Therefore, that fact alone would then mean that the level of the tribe, the proximity of the tribe, cannot be a basis by which we sustain moral thinking. It can only provide a slight foundation that is then built upon in richer ways. So that was my response to that video. But then I recognized this video is actually very sophisticated in that it reflects a common sentiment that is especially happening on the political right, on the far edges of the political right, amongst the dissident right, amongst people who believe the ways of the Enlightenment, amongst people who believe the ethos of the American founding, have all led to modern decadence, have all led to a civilization that can not only support itself by these principles, but is being constantly pillaged and destroyed by antagonists, constantly pillaged and destroyed by enemies. And so they have turned towards the dark ways of the old world, represented not only in the periods before the Enlightenment, where human lifespans were much shorter, where reason was constantly under assault and kept in chains beneath the heels of institutions who thrived not off of being questioned and evaluated, but thrived off of blind submission, where a lot of terrible things that kept man in a very depressed state existed. They also turned towards the regimes of the 20th century and the thinkers who constitute those regimes. And the friend-enemy distinction particularly comes from a thinker called Carl Schmitt. Carl Schmitt was a Nazi jurist. He was a legal expert within the Third Reich, within Nazi Germany, who came up with a bunch of theories that were meant to justify the authoritarian regimes within them. Now, just because somebody is associated with an evil person or an evil thing or an authoritarian thing does not mean their thought should be tarred and marred by that, because even evil people, even those who are authoritarian, oftentimes have things to teach us who are good-natured and those of us who are fundamentally sociable and just and rightly ordered people. There is a great thinker once said, there is a soul of good in all things evil and a seed of evil in all things good. That means nothing is pure. Everything has some kind of flaw or some kind of merit to it, and we ought to evaluate that, and we ought not let our sensibilities get in the way of that. And since I see this kind of thinking rising up in the Western discourse, and since I believe this kinds of thinking is fundamentally anti-Western as conception, it is incumbent upon all of us to confront this. So Carl Schmitt's friend-enemy distinction says the following. I'm going to try to summarize it in the best way possible without making this too dense. It says, first, that conflict is part of the nature of existence. Get that. Conflict is part of the nature of existence. Now, many of us who understand that life is not a very easy road, it's actually really rough and tumble, can actually accept this on the onset. We can actually say, okay, this sounds reasonable, but it's where this statement is taken, the conclusion is taken to, that is the problem. He then says that conflict is basically the essence of the political. The political is not just a government, or it does not just involve a state or something like that. In fact, he says very clearly in the book, The Concept of the Political, where he articulates this friend-enemy distinction, that it doesn't actually matter what the state is or what the government is, because the political is its own thing. In fact, he goes so far to say that the political is so much of its own thing that it is not concerned with morality, economics, or anything else. The political is its own category entirely. And when you try to analyze the political through economics, or analyze the political through morality, you're actually distorting what the political means. So from the offset, Schmitt says, forget morality, forget economics, forget science, forget everything you know about every other topic in the world if you want to understand the political. Now, many of you who are brilliant people or just who are common sense people can already see what the problems are here with this theory, but we continue on. So conflict is inherent to existence. The political is merely the manifestation of conflict within society. And it's also the ability to use power to influence how conflict goes. So, in other words, the political is primarily about power applied to conflict, or the word Schmitt uses is emergency. So, the real essence of the political lies in its ability to mediate emergency, to mediate any impending conflict. And so, since human life is in this face of this looming danger, this looming emergency, this looming conflict, it is contingent upon all of us. It is imperative upon all of us to recognize there is a distinction. There are those who want to fight us, there is the other, and there are those who are our allies. There is the friend. So he then says, therefore, the friend-enemy distinction is the essence of social relationships. He goes on to say that the enemy is not evil. Because remember, Schmitt takes away the moral language from this. He takes away morality and economics. It says those things don't matter. The enemy is just the stranger. The friend is just the person who is familiar to you. So on a very basic and intuitive level, you want to be closer to your friend, or you want to have a strong relationship with your friend, those who you're familiar with, because those you're not familiar with could pose a danger. Then he also says that the enemy is also, being a stranger, someone who could generate conflict for the person. So far, it appears as if the political is merely self-preservation in the face of conflict. Schmitt completely rejects any notion of the political that goes beyond this. And in fact, he goes as far to say that whenever a conflict arises that has something to do with any of the other domains of society, whether it be economics or morality, those conflicts become political. In fact, Schmitt says, and I quote, "A religious community that wages war as a community, be it against members of other religious communities or other wars, is more than just a religious community. It is a political entity. It is also a political entity if it has even a solely negative influence on that decisive event. If it is able to prevent wars by prohibiting its members from participating, i.e. to decisively deny the enemy quality of an opponent. The same applies to an association of people based on economic principles. For example, an industrial concern or a trade union, even a class in the Marxist sense, ceases to be something purely economic and becomes a political entity when it reaches its decisive point, i.e. when it takes the class struggle seriously and treats the class enemy as a real enemy and fights against him. Whether as a state or in a civil war within a state, the will struggle no longer takes place according to economic laws, but has, alongside the methods of combat in the narrowest technical sense, its political necessities, orientations, coalitions, and compromises. And so, this very theory is being used by a lot of people to justify a wide range of positions and justify a reorientation of the political ethos that many of us in the West possess. In other words, it's not just tribalism, because tribalism is one thing, but it is a conflict-based view of human relationships that is fundamentally reductive in that it treats all human relationships within this context as political and ignores any other quality that belongs to human relationships, and then says that any consideration outside the political becomes the political. In other words, it is a totalitarian conception of politics, one that does not admit any kind of credence or any kind of room for real life to actually breathe. And this is the first problem with Schmitt. See, there's this problem in academia, there's this problem in society where thinkers create what is called castles in the air. Their supercharged imagination produces all of these different complex worldviews and systems and ideas and notions. And they then use the observable world, things they see in the observable world, to justify these abstract worldviews and speculations without first beginning with the observable world and then trying to extract from that what the truth is. They have an idea of truth in their head and they impose it upon the world around us. And Schmitt may believe, as he said, that this is the concrete nature of human relationships, that the friend-enemy distinction is actually just how things are and everything else is abstraction. But the truth is, he's imposing his abstract view of human nature, his abstract view of society, and his abstract view of conflict superimposing it over every other domain of society and treating it as if it is the primary standard by which to evaluate the question of the political. And when you do this, you are not operating in good faith. You are not operating with a sense of integrity. You have no rigor. All you have is a speculation that may seem beautiful or may even seem very interesting, but you simply defend it without any reference to reality beyond that. And my friends, man does not build civilization, he does not sustain moral action, he does not refine himself by reference to speculation and abstraction. He refines himself by reference to the facts, the data of the human heart, which is then pushed up and reflected in the data of human nature. And so that is where we're going to see why Schmitt's theory falls apart here, and why everyone else who's citing it, you should question their intentions and also question their intellectual integrity for this very reason. So first of all, on the question of conflict and emergency, the nature of politics is not merely the nature of mediating conflict. It is true, politics most certainly mediates conflict. That is one of the main reasons why the government exists, to ensure that various differing parties are capable of coexisting and commingling in the face of the adversarial process. But this is the effect of politics, not the cause of politics. Politics, at its very nature, from a first principle standpoint, is merely the process of governance, the mechanisms and processes that go into governing a particular area, governing a particular entity of governance. But these mechanisms and processes within themselves do not mean anything beyond the context they're framed in. And the context they're framed in is the context that political order in general is framed in, and that is the context of good governance. Government exists fundamentally not merely to mediate conflict, but also to enable man, independent of conflict, to be able to pursue virtue within civil society, to be able to pursue rightly ordered behavior within civil society. So in other words, government enforces justice to ensure that no one illicitly stops man from being just himself or illicitly stops man from existing in civil society. Government enforces fidelity to ensure that the relationships within civil society, the concrete glue that binds them, is backed up by something more than just a promise, that promises actually have some force behind them. Governments enforce the importance of finding truth so that man in his own world is able to find truth, understand the world around him for himself, including the truth about a political order, including the truth about politics itself. In other words, government does not simply exist to mediate conflict. Government exists as a bulwark to enable the exploration, intellectually and otherwise, of man in his world. Conflict is merely one part of that, because indeed, conflict is going to arise as man explores his world, as man exists in society. But this is the second problem with Schmitt. Schmitt treats conflict as emergency. He treats all kinds of conflict as emergency, and then also treats conflict without defining the difference between conflict and tension. This is another issue. It is true, my friends, that life involves a sense of struggle. I've never liked the old Jordan Peterson line that life is struggle. I think that life is many things. It is this dynamic process that involves a lot of different emotions, feelings, and thinking. But struggle is part of that, but it is not the whole of it. Life is also about inquiry and exploration. Because the moment we stop inquiring, we stop growing. The moment we stop growing is the moment we stop fulfilling the needs of our humanity, which is to persist and grow in the face of adversity, in the face of our own limitations, while also respecting our limitations fundamentally. So life is not just about a struggle. It's also about tension. Tension refines man. And tension within society also refines man. But the moment tension is treated as conflict, and then there is this overarching force which then imposes upon the conflict to effect it, is the moment we're taking away the very tool, or we are pathologizing the very tool which refines man. The founding fathers of America, for example, had quite a lot of conflict within themselves. In fact, some of them even hate each other. However, if we were to accept Schmitt's view, we would have divided the anti-federalists and the federalists between friend and enemy without actually recognizing that within the tension shared by the two groups, there was an overarching project, an overarching bond that was still persistent amid all of the vitriol and all of the hatred. And this overarching bond actually reflects the proper nature of human social relationships. And the conflict was secondary. So tension can look like conflict, but tension that helps us refine and go towards an end that is beyond conflict, even though it looks like conflict, actually builds civilization. So to attempt to pathologize that and make it all conflict and have the political be this overarching force which imposes upon it is to take away one of the basic refining features of man and his society. Another problem that I think is also very interesting is that this friend-enemy distinction misunderstands friendship. This is actually very interesting. There are three levels, my friends, of human fellowship. There is the national level, where within a country we have a kind of affection towards our fellow countrymen, towards those who are, if you're an American, you have affection towards fellow Americans. If you're British, you have affection towards fellow Britons, so on and so forth, providing those people follow the ways of your country and they actually love your country and they're not people imported over that are just there to take up space and not actually contribute. Then on the second level, we have affection towards our general locality. So, for example, if you're in America and you're in a state, if you're a Californian, you might have affection towards fellow Californians, or fellow Michiganders. This is the sort of general. Now, both the national and the general, we really can't interact with those in a very concrete way because they go beyond the capacity of man. We can't account for millions of people within a state, nor can we account for millions of people within a country. We can only engage with those in a very distinct way. But then there is the proximal interaction. There's the proximal level of fellowship. This is our neighbors, our church, our friends, the clerk at the grocery store that you go to all the time, the gas station clerk. These are the people that we can actually interact with. Now, the problem is Schmitt says that those we are familiar with are our friends. Therefore, proximity is what decides friendship. But not only that, but it's also conflict management that also has an impact on this too, because our friends are not necessarily friends in the sense of moral value. He says the moral is not really important here. Our friends are instead friends in the sense that they have a utility to helping us survive and fight the enemy. So there are two things to Schmitt that defines what friendship is. It is proximity and it is advantage. But the problem is this: what happens when those within your in-group actually deviate from the advantage you think they hold from you, and they themselves become detrimental to that? What happens when those within your friend group actually go beyond the proximity, or you go beyond the proximity of that friend group, and you have to interact with other people within the society? Because no society in the modern age is so insulated that we exist on a level of tribes. We now exist on a much broader level within our own civilizations. So the problem is proximity cannot sustain a notion of friendship, because proximity is fleeting and temporal. And so the moment proximity goes away, if you're basing friendship on that, is the moment your familiarity with that particular person is no longer in effect when you go to a new place. So how do you navigate the idea of a stranger or the places of a stranger if you have to treat those in your engagements as strangers, as enemies? You cannot. It is a sort of antagonistic view of human relationships. The truth is this, my friends: friendship is not based on proximity. Proximity foments friendship, because I cannot be friends with someone that is a ghost or whatever. I can't be friends with somebody that doesn't exist. Concrete proximity foments friendship, but very obviously, there are people that live in America and have friends in Britain, live in America, have friends in Australia, so proximity does not bind it. But we are not simply proximal beings. We are civilizational beings, and man goes into different places in his society. Even if he lives in a certain town, he will ultimately go beyond that. So what do you do then? The truth is, friendship is not sustained by proximity. Friendship is first and foremost, my friends, sustained by shared moral core, by shared values, which are built on a foundation of sociability. And this goes into where Schmitt gets man's nature just entirely wrong. Man is not simply existing to survive. Man exists to create. Man exists to build. Man exists to explore and inquire. The testament of the ages will show us this, my friends. Well, the fact that we have Newtons in our civilizations, we've got Darwins, we've got so many different people. We've got people like John Locke, people like Grotius, people like all these different people that have contributed to the enlivening of the human mind throughout the ages. They did not simply preserve themselves within their own groups. They went beyond that and then spoke to the core of existence, and then extracted from that the very principles that we use and understand to understand the world around us. So if it is true that man does not simply exist to survive, but to create, he has to have a context in which creation takes place. And this is enabled by sociability. Sociability is this core principle within our nature that drives man into social engagements and into society. It is the the fertile soil from which society sprouts up and exists, from which our institutions exist. And sociability has to be protected and governed, though, because if sociability it was about anything other than actually cooperation, it wouldn't exist. Sociability is about man's needs being fulfilled that he cannot fulfill himself, and also having that sense of fellowship that is not just proximal, it's civilizational. So there has to be certain rules and certain standards that protect sociability, and there are. Our social nature as man actually gives us the duty to pursue justice, to protect others and their contracts and property and their covenants, and to ensure a culture from which that behavior flows forth, to pursue fidelity, to have a kind of loyalty that is signified by connection within society towards those we know. But that loyalty is not a kind of provincial loyalty that Schmitt was saying. That loyalty is a moral loyalty based on shared values, based on promises, based on contracts, based on covenants. And fidelity does not simply exist within your own group. It exists throughout society. Because if I have no fidelity, why would I drive on a road that is built by somebody else who I may not know if I have no sense that that person is going to respect the safety standards that that road needs to be created? Why am I going to go to a bank with people who I do not know if I have no sense that that bank is not going to keep my money and my funds secured? Fidelity is this universal principle that is applied on a particular level. That's another thing, my friends. Just because we sometimes act. I don't have time. Okay. I don't have time to get to everything I want to get to. Just because we sometimes act amongst groups does not mean our moral behavior is bound by groups. Social interaction is generated from below, and that generation has to do with something that goes beyond that group or beyond that proximity. It has to do with the universal principles that are universal in scope but applied specifically. You don't have any sound conception of society or the stranger or whoever if you don't have this understanding of man's social nature. And man's not just a social being, by the way. He's a social being. But as I mentioned, there's 3 levels of fellowship. And Schmitt likes to say that we are in these groups and everything. But we're not even tribal, we're social. And the social manifests sometimes with the tribe, but when we go beyond the tribe, what happens? It takes on different dimensions. But we're not just social, we're also sentimental beings. We feel. We're also rational beings, we think. And it's the social, the rational, and the sentimental that actually binds together and creates this rightly ordered person. And that bleeds out into our human relationship. Schmitt does not want to excavate in the civic, which is the realm where man's moral duties manifest, which contains society. He wants to excavate in the political, which grows out of the civic. And he wants to say that anyone that believes that the political grows out of the civic are people who believe in abstraction. When in all reality, if we really believe in this idea of connection, of solid connections like he does, social connections, we have to understand what those connections create and what significance that has for civilization. You can only do that if you understand first the nature, man's social nature as a social being. So not only does the friend-enemy distinction flatten human nature by ignoring the dimensions of the social part, not only does it ignore the principles that sustain society and focus instead entirely on conflict, as I've demonstrated, not only does it misunderstand friendship by saying it's about advantage and utility as opposed to about sound values and fulfilling man's sociability. Not only does it do all these things, but it also rejects the moral context in which governance is bound. As I mentioned, good governance is the goal of governance. And the moment you unglue governance from moral order is the moment that political order becomes corrosive to the people, because there is no limiting standard by which the government goes ahead, in Schmitt's terms, to go and mediate conflict. They may do so in a way that actually suppresses and destroys the very real rights of man or the very real natural laws that govern how power ought to be leveraged. Power is not merely a matter of utility. Power is regulated according to what it is, number one, and according to what it can do, and how that interplays with the principles that allow society to exist in the first place. But most importantly, my friends, not only does it see friendship as a means to an end rather than an end in of itself, which is the proper way to see friendship, it also, unfortunately, this is my last point before I go, it also embraces what George Washington said in his farewell address, and what Germaine de Stael said in her brilliant work on the influence of the passions on the happiness of individuals and nations. It's called the spirit of party. So the spirit of party, my friends, is this sentiment that exists within all of our hearts. and it exists in every single man. And it produces this fanatical devotion to a cause, to a movement, to an organization that is beyond man, which then causes them to betray their own values and principles and any faculty that actually keeps them grounded. It basically allows this outside external cause to consume their thinking and consume their behavior, so much so that they don't only lose their values and their faculties, but they also fundamentally lose their sense of self. And the spirit of party is exactly what Washington warned us against. He said the spirit of party could be very destructive to American civilization, because the moment we become consumed in a cause, we forget that we exist in society, we forget our own nature, and we lose the ability to self-correct and self-regulate the worst excesses of our nature, to regulate our passions, and also to use the passions in a way that enlivens and bolsters human relationships as opposed to depresses and destroys them. And yet the spirit of party makes all of those things, just flattens all of them, and then uses man as a tool for some kind of cause. Almost a kind of, if you want to put it in a certain term, almost a kind of possession by idea devoted towards a certain cause, a kind of sentiment overtaking every other part of the man, breaking his rightly ordered nature. Well, the reason the spirit of party rises up in Schmitt's idea is because amongst the friend, again, the friend's not connected to you through mutual values or anything, it's basically just proximity and survival, but you are essentially devoted to the cause of the friend at any cost to defeat the enemy, to persist in the conflict, to beat back the emergency. And this is a fundamental problem, because when man is in this posture where he is used as a tool for a particular end, he is no longer in a posture where he can again be rightly ordered according to principles that govern his conduct rightly and ensure it does not go off the rails. He can no longer consider the nature of his engagements and use a sense of prudence to see if those engagements be corrosive to his life or to the lives of others around him, or if they be acceptable and generous towards it. He can no longer actually evaluate for himself the terms of engagement within society. And when he loses the ability to do that, he fundamentally loses the ability to understand his nature in a very deep way. The spirit of party corrupts our minds, corrupts our imaginations, and puts us in the throes of passion towards a particular cause or idea. And when man does this, even people who are smart, who are intellectual, when they do this, they cease to become thinking people. They cease to be people who are ordered towards the preservation of themselves in society. They actually end up destroying themselves or destroying society, and that the fanatical devotion, destroying the group that they so much claim to love. My friends, we have to object to and reject the friend-enemy distinction and realize that politics is not about friend versus enemy, nor society. Politics is about ensuring that good governance can be ubiquitous throughout society, and also ensuring that fellowship, virtue, and rightly ordered behavior are given room to breathe and grow independent of government influence, independent of state direction, and instead it is brought forth by the governance of man's heart within himself, within his conscience, that helps those things grow. But if we were to accept this conflict-based view of man and political order, we're not going to be able to even get into any of that richer stuff, because we're going to be constantly worried about an emergency, constantly worried about our survival, without realizing that we're not simply meant to survive. Survival enables us to build, create, and then thrive, and then excavate within the matters of life to ensure that posterity and ourselves has a richer understanding of this beautiful tapestry of creation that we are given. My friends, we must embrace this proper understanding of society, and we must reject these old world calls for conflict. And I believe if we do so, then no Schmitt, no people possessed by his ideas, no one is going to be able to stop the growth of the West and also stop the flourishing new age of American civilization. My friends, if you like this video, then please be sure to join the Pensive cohort, which is my collection of young thinkers who are going in to learn about philosophy that founded America and the West more generally. Join the Discord if you want to do that. My friends, like, share, comment, subscribe, donate if you feel so inclined, study history, study philosophy, or anyone really convicted, and please stay pensive, my friends. Bye, guys.